This is not going to be quick. Not because this is difficult to explain, but because there's so much extemporaneous detail that needs to be explained before we can get to the actual point. This isn't complicated. The reasons that fake anarchist capitalists don't understand anarchism are not complicated. But to get to where you can understand both the nature of hierarchy and how fake anarchist capitalists misunderstand that nature of hierarchy needs to be explained first. And that's going to take some time. Hierarchy is a very difficult subject to broach, just in general. When you question hierarchy, people rightfully say, oh, well, hierarchy has been an aspect of not just human society, but a vital aspect of human society throughout the entirety of human history. Further compounding this is that there have been serious misrepresentations about anarchists and how anarchists view hierarchy in mainstream media. Some of it malicious, some of it not, some of it just misunderstanding. But we're going to need to go through all of that just so that you understand where I'm coming from. So the biggest misunderstanding, or perhaps misrepresentation about anarchists, is that anarchists want to get rid of all hierarchies. That is nonsense. You can't do that. The idea of conceptually destroying hierarchies as a whole, as a thing that exists in the human mind, is nonsense. It can't be done. Rather, what anarchism seeks to do is destroy certain specific hierarchies that are understood to be very harmful to people, while only being beneficial to a few, if anyone. Some of these potentially harmful hierarchies that most anarchists understand to be harmful to most people, include race, gender, political class, economic and social class, nationality, and most positions of leadership, because most positions of leadership, most people in positions of leadership use that position to harm people. In fact, the way that I understand to be most beneficial to differentiate different branches of anarchism is who they apply anarchist principles to, and how those principles are applied. For example, you have anarcho-communists, which are the bread and butter of the anarchist movement, at least in a modern context, who apply anarchist principles to most of society. You have anarcho-syndicalists who do the same, but not so much. You also have anarcho-primitivists, or eco-anarchists, who apply anarchist principles to most of the modern world in the same way, but even more, to the point where most of them would dismiss modern technology, and sometimes even medicine, as being harmful to mankind and to the environment. Anarcho-feminists and trans-anarchists apply anarchist principles to gender norms. Fake anarchist capitalists, or facts, as I'm going to be calling them through most of this video, also apply this concept, but they apply it in a way that's incongruent with other branches of anarchism. Facts apply this principle to everything except capitalism. They have internal logic that dictates that capital is always a justified hierarchy, but that falls apart under the slightest scrutiny. And we're going to talk about that, but I want to make a point here. Facts are only able to exist by not analyzing their own worldview through their own lens. Other branches of anarchism explicitly apply anarchist principles to the thing that they're criticizing. Fake anarchist capitalists don't, and avoid doing that. Like, you could call me a communist, and you wouldn't be wrong, but I'm not a communist because I think communist is the bestest. I've looked at the problems that our society are facing, and I believe, for a number of reasons, that communism is the best method of governance that we have to solve the problems that we have right now, considering the resources that we have at our disposal right now. The idea that capital can ever be a justified hierarchy in an anarchist sense falls apart under even the slightest anarchist scrutiny. And that means we can talk about that now. Most branches of anarchism have at least reasonably similar internal logic. Facts have an internal logic that's not only different, but is kind of baffling. But in order to understand them, we need to understand this internal logic and why it doesn't work. And eventually we need to understand why they still cling to it. I also want to mention that I'm going to describe some of the things that fake anarchist capitalists believe as being presuppositions. And I want to emphasize here that that's not necessarily a detraction. Any sort of philosophy, any sort of method of logic has to make some sort of presuppositions. Otherwise, there just isn't anything to work with. People have tried to have systems of reason without presuppositions. It's madness. It just doesn't work in a way that human minds can grasp. Presuppositions aren't bad. It's just that these presuppositions are bad, and for very specific reasons. So I think it's reasonable to state that the first and most vital presupposition that facts make is that no hierarchy that uses violence or coercion is ever a justified hierarchy. This is about half of what the NAP is about. You don't use violence, you don't use coercion, because that delegitimizes your position. The second presupposition, following from the first, is that any consensual interaction is a valid interaction. This is why some facts, not all, not even most, but some facts will get so hung up on the ideas of child sex or slavery. Some of them, again, not all, not even most, but some of them will try to justify that some people, some children can consent to sexual intercourse. Consent to sexual intercourse. They will also try to justify that some people can consent to being put in slavery. I also think that it's worthwhile to note that these arguments are at the very fringes, the very borders of how fake anarchist capitalists function, how their ideal society would function. This isn't a common thing in their rhetoric. It seems like it is, but that's because people like me are always challenging them on that. They're forced to talk about those points because other people force them to talk about those points frequently. It's the same reason that anti-fascists like myself are forced to talk about violence all the time, because violence is always the thing that you bring up when you talk to anti-fascists, regardless of the fact that violence is not even very common, as I've explained before. A corollary to that second principle is that any interaction that is not consensual is always invalid. That's about what the other half of the NAP is about. The third principle, and this is the important one for our purposes, is that capital by itself has no coercive qualities, and that the exchange of capital, the consensual exchange of capital, is always mutually beneficial. Through these understandings, we can make a couple more assumptions about the FAC worldview, namely that violence is never consensual, and that capitalism is never violent, or that capital is never violent. The exchange of capital, unless it is explicitly through violence, is never violent. Also, through these understandings, we can understand the majority of FAC praxis. The state, for example, is not a legitimate hierarchy because it exclusively uses violence, whether it violently seizes capital through taxes, or whether it violently imprisons people. Because capital is not coercive, is definitionally never coercive, it becomes the perfect vector with which to make decisions. Any exchange of capital becomes mutually beneficial. And I want to say here, if I've gotten anything wrong here, or rubbed any facts the wrong way, please let me know. I want to understand your worldview better, and I do try to be open to criticism when I can. At least when the criticism is made in good faith. So I'm going to assume that I have some fake anarchist capitalists watching this right now. Hi. I'm going to try to put my worldview, my philosophy, my ultimate point to you, not as simply as I can, but in a way that I think you'll understand. So what I want you to do is I want you to take every criticism you have of the government, its coercive qualities, its use of violence, the lack of consent in interactions. And I want you to understand that that is the anarchist criticism of the boss. Let me explain. So there's a central conceit of capitalism, that capitalism enables the best people to rise to the top of society, to rise to positions of power in that society. That's why a lot of capitalists, not all capitalists, but a lot of capitalists seem to like Donald Trump. He proves that success in capital translates directly to success in society. All that regardless of how Donald Trump has not really been successful in capital, as it has recently come out. But that's a digression for another time. We'll put a pin in that. What really happens is that over time, capital tends to centralize in a smaller and smaller number of hands. And the most successful people in capitalism tend to be the people that make that centralization more efficient. That's why banks tend to be so wealthy in almost any version of capitalism. And that's why stocks are the most profitable endeavor in our society right now. They're basically exchanging capital explicitly between the rich. And just as a further example of how this works, look at how our society functions. Really pull back and take a look at it. We have the ability right now to ensure that maybe not everyone, but most people live full and healthy and long lives. And instead of that, our entire society is built around providing an ever-dwindling number of people with as much power and success and wealth as they can possibly snatch up. Our society is literally run by who has the most seashells. This situation creates a baked-in coercion in our society. If a handful of people control the vast amount of capital in society, and everyone in that society requires capital to get things that they need to live, then any success you have in capitalism is going to be dependent on how well you serve the needs of the people who have the capital. I know I said this in my last video, but I want to re-emphasize it. People in our society are not denied access to food, or clothing, or shelter, or health care because those things are too scarce to go around. We have more than enough of those things right now to provide for everyone on Earth. Those things that people need to live are being denied to them by denying them access to capital. And this isn't just about whether or not a person has the ability or the willingness to participate in capitalism in any meaningful capacity. There are plenty of people who do have the ability and do have the willingness to participate in capitalism, but are still willfully denied access because someone has decided that it's more profitable to them to deny that person access to capital. And if what I'm saying isn't perfectly clear, let me make it perfectly clear. Poverty only exists because capitalists decided that they need poverty to exist. We do not need poverty. It is not a necessary state for anyone. Poverty exists because there have been and are capitalists that take advantage of it. This is why me, and people who believe as I do, consider the boss to be evil. Our entire well-being, our livelihood, our existence is dependent on their whim and how well we suit their needs in capital. And their lives, their livelihood, their very existence is dependent on how well they serve their boss. And so on, and so forth. The boss is always being coerced. And the boss exists only to coerce. Our society is precariously balanced on the edge of the whims of a fraction of a handful of people. Any one of them could withdraw from society at any time, pick up their toys and go home. They would be fine, but they would leave millions of people destitute. You cannot tell me that isn't coercive. You cannot tell me that isn't inherently coercive. You would either be deluded or you would be lying. So it should be understood that I know all of these things because other people know all of these things and told these things to me. Because people aren't stupid, and you need to get it out of your head that they are. But even in that context, I also understand that there are some default criticisms that fake anarchist capitalists have of the points that I've made, which I will now recite to you in what my dad used to call the marshmallow voice. Yeah, you're not talking about real capitalism, you're talking about corporations, or crony capitalism, not real capitalism where people make decisions based on their best interests, I think. It doesn't really work. So the thing is, you can't separate praxis from theory. Or at the very least, you can't separate praxis from theory without admitting that there are very serious problems with your theory or your praxis. We have 100+ years of observing how capitalism works. And how we have observed it works, time and time again, is that over time, it collects in a smaller and smaller number of hands, in a greater and greater amount. This is often regardless of whether or not there are regulations in place to prevent that. Because of how capital works, it is very easy to subvert any kind of meaningful regulation. People are doing it now. Yeah, most of the problems in society can be solved through meaningful charity. I want to pass on the buck to some other schmuck. You can take care of it, I don't need to. Problem solved. So this is a particularly nasty half-truth. I'm not going to criticize anyone for participating in or giving to charities, because charities do a lot of good in the world. What charities don't do is solve the problem of poverty. And we know that because solving something means that it becomes solved. It stops existing. Or at least it stops existing in such a meaningful way. And not only has poverty not stopped, but poverty has gotten much, much worse. Even the capitalists admit it, and they use standards meant to be loaded in their favor. That's not even talking about how people like me view poverty. Yeah, you're just jealous because you're not a billionaire yourself. You want all the money and other goods to yourself because you're a selfish bastard just like I am. Not jealous. Furious. Furious at 100,000 wrongs inflicted upon me and the people I love every day by a system that incentivizes us to harm ourselves for the well-being of a handful of rich perverts. My fury is so deep that it is without bottom, so wide that it is without end, so vast that it dwarfs oceans, seas, and the far-flung depths of space. Not jealousy. I do not want to have. I want to annihilate. And we will, with time. It's on my to-do list. Yeah, but what do you know anyway? You're just an uneducated soy boy who's a rube from cornfield land. You even say that yourself. You have the IQ of a gorilla. What do you know about anything? I bet you can't even count to 10. You know what? Fine, sure. I guess you can't spell wrong without Ron, and that makes me wrong. So, you know, if you're, just throwing this out here, if you're so much smarter than me and I'm so wrong, it should be pretty obvious, pretty easy for you to be able to clarify why I'm wrong down in the comments, shouldn't it? Go ahead, do that for me. I await your criticism. Anyway, that's about all I need to say here. Let's take it over to Editing Ron with the editing goodness. Editing Ron, you got this? That took 12 hours. That took 12 hours to do. It is currently 2:30 in the morning. I don't know if you can see that. I don't expect you to be able to see that. But I want you to know that I've been working on this, not non-stop. I've been taking breaks. I've been keeping hydrated. But I've been working on this constantly for the last 12 hours. I'm not complaining. Nobody asked me to do that. But sometimes I feel like, especially bigger YouTube people, get a lot of shit for not having as much content. As someone who does really basic videos, let me tell ya, it's really fucking hard. So I'm still planning on doing that Q&A video, which is going to be a couple of other things too. I'm either going to do it next week or the week after that. So if you have any questions, my Curious Cat is still open. I'll leave a link to it in the underbar. Or you can leave a question under one of my videos, or in my community tab. Or you can get in touch with me on Discord. I'll leave a link to the video where I talk about this month's update video. It'll be up there somewhere. A few things that I wanted to touch on that weren't in the video proper. FAQ is really stilted and forced, and I'm going to stop using it now. Ugh. Why did no one tell me? Why did none of you tell me? So to any people who say that... So to any fake anarchist capitalists, because that's what I'm going to call you now, to any fake anarchist capitalists who say that it's unrealistic to suppose that, you know, someone might even want to leave society and run off and do their own thing, that's literally the plot of Atlas Shrugged. And I mean, surely you've read Atlas Shrugged. I have, more than once. There's a little thing that I don't think I got to put anywhere in the video proper, but kind of wanted to. The fake anarchist capitalist idea didn't actually evolve from anarchism proper. It evolved from, like, classical libertarianism. That's why there's so much emphasis on consent and, you know, violence. Those are things that liberals tend to be concerned about. And I mean proper proper liberals, not like the watered-down version we have here in the U.S. I think that's everything I have to say. I'm all sayed out. I'm all tuckered out, too. So the next video, the next scripted video anyway, is going to be about how fake anarchist capitalists don't understand free speech. Although there's going to be a bit of a trick to it. Because a lot of times they're not talking about free speech. And we will get into that. But until we get there, take care of yourselves, alright?